Welcome, everybody, to the 2022 virtual mid-year tax meeting. First, I want to apologize for being late. Everything was working until 1 minute before I went to get on, and for some reason, my mic stopped working. So I had to reboot, and here I am. So I was going to start with how great virtual meetings are. And I guess, as we all know, they have their positives and their negatives. But I do want to start with thanking all of our members really for their loyalty throughout these really difficult times. And we have done everything that we can possibly do to make these virtual meetings the best possible experience and to replicate the good things about our traditional meetings. But there's some things that we just can't replicate. And one of those is the camaraderie, chance encounters that come when we meet in person. So I know we're all anxious to get back to those times. One silver lining, though, from these virtual meetings is that we have more people who are able to join. As of this morning, the attendance stands at over 1,300. I also want to welcome our first-time attendees. Again, we have more first-time attendees than ever, and that's fantastic. And I hope that people who are attending the virtual meetings will be motivated to come and join us and meet with us when we get back to in-person meetings. For anybody and you don't have to be a new member for this or, a new meeting attendee, but for anybody who's interested in getting more involved in committees, and as you guys know, the committees are kind of the lifeblood of the section, and it's through the committees that we do many things, government comments, presentations, all of these things kind of run through our committees. And we're going to have an information and networking session at 4:30 Eastern today. It's from 4:30 to 5:30. And it's for new and veteran members, and it's about connecting with tax section committees. So please check in on that. I also want to give a huge and heartfelt thanks to our sponsors. These meetings really couldn't happen without their support. And I particularly want to thank our diamond sponsor, Tax Notes. But I also want to thank all our emerald sponsors, many of who return meeting after meeting. And the emerald sponsors for this meeting are Blue Jay, Kaplan and Drysdale, Ernst & Young, Eversheds Sutherland, Holland and Knight, Castellanets and Fink, Nelson Mullins, and the U.S. Virgin Island Economic Development Authority. And I also want to thank Thomson Reuters, who's our publishing sponsor for the tax section, and the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, who's the educational affiliate of the tax lawyer. For now, just getting right into business, I have the very happy job of announcing the nominations submitted by the nominating committee. And this is for the term, ABA has a fiscal year. And so this is for the fiscal year that begins essentially this August after the big ABA's annual meeting. And so had a spoiler there, but our chair-elect is Scott Michael. And I want to say about everybody, and definitely Scott included, that we're really lucky for all of the fantastic people who were willing to give their time to the section. We just have a terrific group of leadership this year. So Scott will be taking over my position, and I know he's going to be fantastic. Now, for our vice chairs, we have David Wheat, who's from Houston, Texas, and he's going to be returning as our vice chair of administration. Mary McNulty from Dallas, Texas, will be starting as vice chair of committee operations. Tom Greenaway from Boston, Massachusetts, will be returning as vice chair CLE. Lisa Zarlinga from Washington, D.C., will be starting as vice chair government relations. Carolyn Cirolo from Washington, D.C., will be returning as vice chair membership, diversity, and inclusion. Anthony Infante, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, will be starting as Vice Chair Pro Bono and Outreach. And Roberta Mann from Eugene, Oregon, will be returning as Vice Chair Publications. And again, this is everybody I'm going to read. So now I want to go to announcing the secretary, assistant secretary, and the council directors. For secretary, we have Christine Spidel from Villanova, Pennsylvania, and she'll be returning as secretary, and Lonnie Villalobos from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, returning as assistant secretary. The new council directors that we'll have, and each will be serving 3-year term, will be Leslie Book from Villanova, Pennsylvania, Scott Levine, Washington, D.C., Stephanie Lipinski Gallange from Tysons, Virginia, Mary Slonina from Washington, D.C., and Elizabeth Stevens from Washington, D.C. Next, we have the Christine Brunswick Public Service Fellowship, and that's a 2-year fellowship to introduce people who are newer in practice to public service. And this year, I have the honor of announcing Anna Gooch as our Christine Brunswick Public Service Fellow, and for the 2022 to 2024 term. So again, that's going to be starting around September 1 of this year. So Anna will be working for the Center for Taxpayer Rights in Washington, D.C. Anna's a research fellow with the Center for Taxpayer Rights, and she also assists low-income taxpayers through pro bono work with Villanova Federal Tax Clinic and the Justice and Diversity Center of the Bar Association of San Francisco. Prior to joining the Center for Taxpayer Rights, Anna worked as an international tax consultant at Deloitte in San Francisco. She received her JD MBA and LLM from Villanova University. So Anna will work with the Center for Taxpayer Rights to develop a low-income tax clinic. So when we say LITC, that's what we're referring to, support center, which will match LITCs with pro bono attorneys, create training and resources for LITC practitioners, and identify barriers to taxpayer rights and potential solutions. So we're really excited about that project. I think it's a much needed service, and we're just very happy to see Anna taking that on through the Center of Taxpayer Rights. So next announcement is, and this is our kind of last piece of business, are the winners of the Law Student Tax Challenge. So the first place winner is team number 7 for LLM. So I'm sorry, starting with LLM, and congratulations to team number 7. That's Adnan Alam and Milia Mbunefo, and they're from Temple University Beasley School of Law, and their coach is Andrew Weiner. And I have to say, I watched a lot of the challenges, and the teams were just so excellent, all of them. The second place winner is team number 9. Again, this is for the LLM. And that's Paige Cham and Anastasia Jones, and they're from the University of Florida Levin College of Law, and their coach is Charlene Luke. The best for the LLM, the best written work is for team number 5, and that's Otto Bosch and Micah Moore, and they're at the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law, and their coach is Judith Frame. Now for the JD winners. First place, team number 18, and we have Holden Branscombe and William Gibo, and they're from the University of Memphis, Cecilia C. Humphreys School of Law, and their coach is William Kratzky. The second place team is team number 37, and that's Max Cargall Bly and Hans Chin of the University of Washington School of Law. And their coach is Scott Shoemaker. Third place team, number 6, and that's Allison Martinez and Chloe Webb. They're with the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law, and their coach is Judith Frame. The best written is team number 37 again, and that's Max Cargall Bly and Han Shin, University of Washington School of Law. Again, coach is Scott Shoemaker. So congratulations to everybody. I think it's I hope a great experience for everybody. And we just again had a terrific group this year. So our next big meeting, my last meeting as chair, is going to be the 2022 May tax meeting. We're shooting for a hybrid meeting at the Marriott Marquis in Washington, D.C. And, we're very hopeful that it's going to be in person and online. And that will be from May 12th to 14th, 2022. So with that, I think that's most of our announcements, but I do want to, we do have 2 speakers, and the first speaker we've got is going to be helping talk about a fellowship program that we've just launched. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about the fellowship program. I'm really excited about it. It's the Loretta Collins Argrett Fellowship. And the goal of this fellowship is to create a more accessible and equitable pipeline into the section of taxation and into the tax bar. We hope to award up to 5 fellowships a year, and each fellowship is going to be each fellow is going to be serving a 3-year term. The fellowship pays for ABA section dues, registrations, tax section dues, registrations at meetings, travel and accommodation costs to our main meetings. And, it also provides complimentary meeting registration and access to ticketed events. So basically the goal is to pay for, everything that somebody, that's associated with somebody's activity in the tax section. And again, that'll be we'll be doing that for 3 years. We'll also have and be working hard, not just to spend money, but also give a lot of time and effort to help building future leaders of the section. We're going to have special events to introduce fellows to, tax section activities. And we're also going to assign each fellow with 2 mentors for the duration of their 3-year term. So applications for this inaugural class of fellows is due April 3rd. And if you know any good candidates, I hope you'll send them our way. In fact, by the time we're done, if there's a place to post, I'm gonna post the link that will to the application for the fellowship program. We're also going to be calling on for mentors, and when we put out that call, I hope that our section members will respond. Our hope is not to just have mentors for the Loretta Collins Argrett fellows, but also for our Nolan fellows and our Christine Brunswick public service fellows. And even for those of you who don't feel like you want to make a commitment to be a formal mentor, please be informal mentors and sponsors, especially as we start meeting in person again. That's going to be so important. And I know, from my own experience, I wouldn't be here in front of you today if I hadn't had mentors taking me under their wing and helping me when I was a young member. And finally, if you have any interest in providing financial support for the program, we've established a new endowment fund through the ABA Fund for Justice and Education. And so that's a 501c3 organization. And the goal of the endowment is to provide stable long-term funding for the Loretta Collins Argrett Fellowship and the section's other diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So I'm truly excited because we're going to hear next from Loretta Collins Argrett herself. I wish I had time to really tell you about Loretta and the milestones she's achieved and the glass ceilings she's broken and the doors she's burst through. But just briefly, and again, I'll try to see if I can post a bio, a full bio of Loretta in the chat. But Loretta grew up in segregated Mississippi, went to Howard University at the age of 16, graduated with a degree in chemistry, studied as a fellow at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland, and went on to have a stellar career as a chemist. But she also was a community and workplace activist. And it was through that experience that she was inspired to switch to a career in law. So Loretta realized through her activist experience the importance of diverse representation. She uprooted her family and enrolled to study at Harvard Law School. And also, by recognizing the importance of diversity and representation, that led her to a path of being a business lawyer. And as a tax lawyer, Loretta just achieved a head-spinning series of firsts. She was the first African-American staff member of the Joint Committee of Taxation, the first African-American woman partner at her law firm, the first African-American to serve as the Assistant Attorney General Tax Division in the U.S. Department of Justice. She was also the first African-American woman in the Justice Department history to hold a position that required Senate confirmation. She also served as a tenured professor at Howard Law School, and she was in private practice. So Loretta was just a force of nature. And you can see from the importance of the positions that she held, how critically important it is to have people with diverse perspectives in those posts. Our tax system allocates economic resources, reflects our nation's values, and is so often the primary vehicle that we use to provide a social safety net to vulnerable populations. So we only need to look at the pandemic to see how critical the tax section is and to appreciate its power. And with that, we recognize how critical it is that there be a diversity of views and experiences reflected in how tax laws are written, how tax laws are interpreted, and how tax laws are enforced. It's for that and many other reasons that this section is committed to diversifying our organization and the tax bar. So with that, I'm honored to introduce Loretta herself, who was gracious enough not only to lend us her name for the fellowship, but also to give us her time today.
Thank you. I am delighted to have the opportunity to be with you again. This morning, I want to take a few minutes to do several things. First of all, I want to thank the section for an honor that I never could have imagined. To be honest, I was stunned when Julie, our section chair, called, told me about the fellowship program, and then asked if I would agree to the section naming it after me. I thought to myself, did she say, would I agree? All I could think was, wow. Yes, I had tried to bring more women and minorities into our profession, but I never felt I had done enough. Also, I had recognized, as you have, that while individual efforts are important, institutional efforts are necessary. So I applaud you for establishing the fellowship program and thank you for naming it after me. I am unbelievably honored. And if this is a dream, I don't want to wake up. Secondly, I want to thank you for the establishment of the Sections D&I initiative. In my view, it has been expertly designed and contains all the necessary parameters to ensure its success. The section's leadership will need the help of all of you to assure its success. And I urge each of you to review the D&I details on the section's website and consider how you can help to make the program a success. The plan outlines action steps, responsible persons, and expected dates for actions to be taken. By the way, I was not surprised by this. What would I expect other than that? After all, we are tax lawyers, and our lives revolve around planning, determining who's responsible, and assuring deadlines are met. Also, please familiarize yourself with the fellowship program documents. The section again will need your individual assistance in identifying and recruiting potential candidates and participating in activities to assure their success once they are selected. There is one other important thing that I want to remind you, that is, section members individually also benefit when a person you help succeeds. We human beings can get a great deal of satisfaction when a person you help succeeds. I had several opportunities to experience that with young lawyers who came to work with me in the front office at the tax division. Every one of them, every one of them went on to bigger jobs with more responsibilities and more prestige and have done very well professionally. Let me tell you about one person whose name all of you will know. When I arrived at the tax division, I learned that there were hardly any African American lawyers among the division's 350 lawyers. I could even count the number of African American lawyers on one hand, and I would need all of these 5 fingers to count them. I decided to change that. Well, it wasn't as easy as I had hoped. I had difficulty finding candidates. Then I realized that I needed help. Fortunately, I remembered Samuel Thompson, a Black lawyer whom I had met in the tax section. And he was and is a nationally known tax lawyer, law professor, law dean, and prolific author, among other things. So I called him, told him what I was trying to do, and asked him, did he have any students he might recommend? I don't remember him hesitating at all. He said yes. Then I asked if anyone was interested, and he would recommend them send me their resume. Sam kept his word. And shortly thereafter, I received Tamara Ashford's resume. It was perfect. My hiring committee did its work and due diligence, and I hired her. She began her career as a tax lawyer in our appellate section. As they say, the rest is history. I can't tell you how excited I was when she was confirmed as the first African American female tax court judge. Now, I had nothing to do with that at all. She achieved her tremendous success on her own merits. Sam and I merely opened a door through which she could pass, and given the opportunity, she achieved spectacularly. But every time I think of her, I think to myself, my life has not been in vain. Many of you may have similar experiences when you observe the success of the fellows you select. Now, let me take a few moments to share with you why I believe this fellowship program, as it's structured, will be a stunning success and will achieve the section's goals. I will outline one or two informal and mostly happenstance events that happened to me that put me on a career trajectory to succeed. I had not planned to be a tax lawyer and probably would not have even considered it at that time. I wanted to be a business lawyer. But when I went to Argrett, Fox, Kentner, Plotkin, and Kahn in DC as a summer clerk in their business section, I realized that almost every assignment I received required me to do some tax analysis. Of course, I was naive, but not unlike so many law school students or young lawyers today. In any event, I was offered a job at the end of the summer, and I returned as an associate after graduation from Harvard Law School. Their associate program was excellent and was designed to integrate new associates into practice. I had no problems, felt a part of the practice, and did well, even though I was the only African American in the section. One partner for whom I had not done any work before called me in for an assignment. I did it. And then sometime later, he called me in for another assignment. After I had completed it, he told me he wanted me to become active in the tax section. I just looked at him. I don't remember saying anything. After all, what would I say? I remember thinking this must mean he approves of my work. But at the same time, I thought this would mean extra work, and I was already juggling being an associate, a mother of 2 children at home, and being a wife. So I think I just smiled and said nothing. Associates did not do small talk with him, even though he was a really nice guy. That partner was Jack Sexton, whom some of you older members of the section may remember. He was tough, demanding, and a wonderful lawyer. Well, he did what he said, and I became a member of the depreciation committee. That's what it was called way back then. That action of his was the beginning of my tax section life and led to years of work in the section by me, culminating with my service as a member of the section's governing council. None of this would likely have happened without Jack taking the initiative to introduce me to tax practice and the tax section. Jack Sexton's placing me on the section's depreciation committee also played a key role in something else that happened a few years later in my career. A law school friend who was working for Harold Ford, a Black congressman from Tennessee, called and asked me to send him my CV. I objected, said I was happy where I was, and I was not looking for a job. Well, he said Ford was concerned that the Joint Committee on Taxation had had no Black staff persons. My friend wanted me to send him my CV so he could give it to Harold Ford to see what would happen. I demurred, but he begged me to send it anyway. Well, I thought nothing was going to happen, so why not? Then the next thing I know, I am called for an interview. Again, I still thought nothing was going to happen. But at that point, I felt I couldn't decline the interview. As most of you may know, I was interviewed, and Bobby Shapira, who was the chief, offered me the job. Now I had a real dilemma. I would receive less pay, and my ultimate goal in law practice was really to prove to myself that I could make partner. At this point, by happenstance, I saw on the street at lunchtime a prominent DC lawyer, Steph Tucker, who most of you know as well, who was also part of tax section leadership. I stopped him to chat with him, told him about my joint committee offer, my dilemma, and my ultimate goal. He told me that I should take it, that it would be a great career move for me, as it was only a 2-year commitment. I took his advice, and of course, he was absolutely right. Now, guess what project I was assigned when I arrived at the Joint Committee? I was assigned to the project that resulted in the enactment of new legislation, the Capital Cost Recovery Tax Provisions, that was enacted in 1981, which, as you know, revised the old depreciation rules. I am sure my work on the tax section's depreciation committee had a lot to do with my hiring and that assignment. Now, let me conclude by telling you why the fellowship's program's design will help integrate the fellows into a full and active participation in the section. Let me contrast that with my early days as a member. I will have to admit there were times early on I would return home from section meetings saying that I wasn't going to go again because I knew almost no one there. While people were generally friendly, everyone was very busy. I wasn't invited to lunch or dinner with groups that were going. Even at plenary sessions, I had noticed from the very beginning there were very few women there. And except for Samuel Thompson, who I mentioned earlier, I don't remember seeing any other Blacks. But I kept going because I learned a lot about substantive tax issues that was helpful. And of course, over time, I made friends with other lawyers. The fellowship program will do what Jack Sexton did for me. That is, identifying potential candidates for membership and then introducing them to the tax section. The fellows program itself, as structured, will facilitate the integration of these fellows into the tax section program and help them through its programs and structure to get to know other tax section members. Finally, once the fellows learn about tax practice and its importance in practice areas generally, they may choose to become tax section members, even though they don't consider themselves or plan to be tax lawyers. They may do this because through their participation in section programs, they will learn how tax implications affect every practice area. So don't be surprised when would-be litigators, general business lawyers, entertainment lawyers, real estate lawyers, estate planners, or whatever they deem themselves to be, decide that membership in the tax practice will benefit them, one, with much knowledge that they will need, and two, just as importantly, they will have increased introductions and contacts with nationally known tax experts. Now, you have heard how fortunate I was to cross paths with some good, kind-hearted, and fair individuals who opened some doors for me. The Fellows Program will do this on a more macro level to some deserving individuals. Thank you so much for what the tax section has meant to me, but more importantly, what you will do for others, and just as importantly, for the benefit the tax section will receive from the program. Once again, thank you.
Thank you so much to Loretta. We really appreciate your time today and for everything that you're doing for the section. And now I have the really great honor of introducing our plenary speaker, William G. Gale. He's the R.J. and Francis Miller Chair in Federal Economic Policy and in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution. His research focuses on tax policy, fiscal policy, pensions, and savings behavior. He's the author of Fiscal Therapy, Curing America's Addiction to Debt and Investing in the Future. He's a co-founder and co-director of the Tax Policy Center, the joint venture of the Brookings Institution and the Urban Institute. And he's also director of the Retirement Security Project. Bill previously served as vice president of Brookings and director of the Economic Studies program. Prior to joining Brookings, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a senior economist for the Council of Economic Advisors under President George H.W. Bush. I'm really looking forward to Bill Gale's remarks today. We all appreciate the fundamental role that economists play in shaping tax policy. And as you heard from my introduction of Bill, he's one of the premier tax economists in the nation. Today, Bill's going to explore the intersection of race and public policy. This is really groundbreaking work, since mainstream public finance research has largely ignored racial issues for decades. So instead of telling you more about what Bill's going to say, I think we're going to get right to it and let him talk. But I really, really appreciate his agreement to be here today.
All right, thank you. It's a great honor to be here today to speak to you about public finance and racism. And let me start by congratulating Loretta, not only on her accomplishments, but on the path she took to reach those accomplishments. The story that she told is inspiring and should be told more often, and is an excellent example of how change can happen, even if it takes time. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to give. We go to the next item. I want to start with a general disclaimer that I do not present myself as an expert on racism. I think of myself as an expert on tax policy, who's trying to understand the implications of racism for tax policy. As an economist, I'm handicapped by the fact that our profession has not been at the forefront of addressing these issues. Legal scholarship has been much more tuned to the issue, and I want to emphasize that I did not add that line just for this talk. I've been saying that from the very beginning, and I've learned an enormous amount from the legal literature. So my goal here is to connect tax analysis and racism. That's obviously an enormous task. I'm going to focus on the conceptual side, not any of the empirical work and not any policy issues, though of course there is significant empirical work and there are extremely important policy issues. You might actually think of this paper as explorations in public finance and racism rather than the more declarative public finance and racism. And I'm going to focus on discrimination against Black people, but of course you can use this to think about other forms of discrimination also. So let's go to the next slide. I got into this literature and this issue after George Floyd was murdered. And I spent the next 6 months reading probably 20 books and 50 articles, many of which were law review articles, which almost count as another book. But here are just some overall conclusions from reading this literature that just seem inescapable. I'm not going to spend time on this. I just want to use this as a framing device. First, there is widespread, longstanding, continuing discrimination on the basis of race. I don't see how that's debatable, and it's had enormous and lasting deleterious effects. I don't see how that's debatable either. What I learned in reading this is that public policies were not innocent bystanders in all this. They actually played a major role in contributing to the extent and the effects of racism. That's the bad news. The good news is that it means that public policy can also help on the upside in reducing the effects of racism. And in terms of economics, I think of addressing racism as a second best policy issue. And to be clear here, second best does not refer to the quality of the policy. It refers to the state of the world. When there are pre-existing distortions, then the kind of the standard economic welfare theorems don't hold. And so you have to work in a second best, what's called the second best world. Really, we're in an nth best world. But a second best world is one where there are already existing distortions. So policy needs to jump in cognizant of those distortions. The important implication of that is that policies that are race aligned are with respect to the treatment are not with respect to outcomes. And so typically what those policies do is cement in place earlier injustices, and they extend and continue discrimination. That's I think is a fundamental point that is not well understood in the public discussion, and I'll give an example of that in a second. So let's go to the next slide. I want to focus on three general issues. The paper started with the second and third issues, which is, as I was reading this big literature, I noticed that the analytical choices that one makes in tax policy kind of have parallels to the analytical choices that people make in the study of racism. And I'll talk about those when we get there. And the thing that really spurred me to think about this was the idea that there are parallel topics, that issues like anti-racism can be written in very clear economic terms as a basically a second best policy. And I'll come to that too. The issue I tried to avoid in the first several versions of this paper was this issue of what makes a policy racist. And it just wouldn't go away. And when I gave the talk, when I thought about the issues, when I read about it, so I originally had what makes a policy racist as a category that I was not going to talk about. But then I felt ultimately that I couldn't do that. So the first section is actually talks about what is a racist policy, what's not a racist policy. And let's turn to that now. So one thing, if you think about this, a formal definition that is actually operational is almost impossible, or so far has been impossible to come up with. You can make both type 1 and type 2 errors, seeing racism when it's not there and not seeing racism when it's in there. And I'm still not sure which is a type 1 and a type 2. Having said that, some policies are just clearly racist. They're motivated by racial animus, or they explicitly punish Black people. The best example is redlining, which took place in the last century and limited where people could live. Note that in describing these things, this definition is not symmetric across race. I'm not ruling out affirmative action here. I'm just saying that some policies clearly discriminate in ways that are obvious. If we go to the next slide, Ibram Kendi, in his book "How to Be an Anti-Racist," gives a more expansive definition. Says it's any policy, any measure, a policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity. Note a couple of things about this. One is that it focuses on outcomes, not the treatment. Second is that it has nothing to say about racial animus. That's neither necessary nor sufficient to cause a policy to be racist. And then, of course, the analyst and all of us notes that there's no airtight definition of inequity. So we have to think about that. If inequity means unequal outcomes, all right, then almost every policy is racist. For example, even if we had universal health care, Black families probably live in neighborhoods where there are not as many doctors, not as many hospitals. They may not have faith in the medical system because of Tuskegee and other events. And so the outcomes, even of a universal healthcare system, would likely not be equal between racial groups. Let's go to the next slide. So if inequity doesn't mean unequal outcomes, and most likely it doesn't, I don't think Kendi would limit himself that way. Then it needs to be you need a definition to make it operational, and that, in a way, that's a punt. That's saying, well, you know it when you see it. On the other hand, I think there's a more positive, constructive way to interpret it, which is that it basically argues that a new existing policy should be accompanied by whatever changes are needed to make sure that the new policy is equitable. So with healthcare, coming back to universal healthcare again, maybe we have universal healthcare, maybe that's supplemented with an effort to get more medical doctors in Black communities. Maybe it's supplemented by public relations efforts to explain why universal healthcare is important, etc. The point is not to just dump the policy out there, but to think about the things that would make the policy work effectively and equitably for all categories of people. If you go to the next slide, there's a well-known picture that discusses the definition between equality and equity, and I don't think this needs to be explained, but there's a great example that just happened a couple of days ago when the Biden administration agreed to send every household 4 COVID tests. So it doesn't matter if the people in the household are old or young, if there are 10 people in the household or 1 person in the household, everybody gets the same number. So that's equality, as in the first, as in the left side, but you might argue that it's not really equity in a meaningful sense. All right, so let's keep going. All right, so what I want to emphasize is the second best issue, this role of pre-existing conditions and policies. And I asked my research assistant to come up with the most innocuous, simple, clear example that she could come up with, so we could talk about what's racist in that example. She came up with this idea that every child, suppose there's a policy proposal that every child with a library card gets a book. And the question is that racist or not? This is what we did last summer. We sat around and thought of policies and debated whether they were racist or not. Now, at the surface, and if you asked me this 2 years ago, I would say, no, don't be ridiculous. Of course, that's not racist. All right. Now, I would say, well, it depends on other conditions and other policies. So suppose Black households don't have good access to libraries. Either they live in library deserts, or maybe they have less access to a car or a computer, and assume, for purposes of this example, that those conditions are due to at least some important extent to past racism and past racist policies. Let's go to the next slide. So it also depends on pre-existing policies, right? Suppose there is a pre-existing, what I'll call policy 0, that only white children can get library cards. All right, that's obviously a racist policy in itself, but you can imagine variants of the policy that have that same effect, even if they're not as explicit as only white children can get library cards. Next slide, please. So whether policy 1 is racist is dependent on the situation. I never would have thought of this 2 years ago, but I feel now that if policy 0 is not repealed, that is, if only white kids can get library cards, then policy 1, giving kids with library cards books, is racist. it simply exacerbates the effect of policy 0, which is a clearly racist policy. If policy 0 is repealed so that anyone can get a library card, whether policy 1 is racist or not isn't as obvious to me. It helps all kids, but it might exacerbate inequality. It might help white kids more than black kids for the reasons I mentioned above. And coming back to Kendi's point, it doesn't do anything to correct the differential access to libraries, which again was caused in part by racism, by construction. So Kendi would say, I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but logically thinking, extending his logic, that sure, go ahead and give kids the books, but implement other policies so that that policy is equitably shared across different sets of kids. All right, so let's keep going. All right, now if you can go from giving kids a free book with a library card to racism that fast, right? You can be assured that in important real world examples, you're going to find similar pre-existing conditions or policies that influence the effect of the current policy. For example, think of the mortgage interest deduction as a policy 1, the equivalent of giving free books to kids with library cards. Well, that has occurred in an environment where redlining was a legal reality for almost 50 years, and to some extent is a continuing reality. Redlining, of course, reduces the value of people's home, which means it's harder for them to take the mortgage interest deduction, especially now after the 2017 Tax Act, where the mortgage interest deduction only goes to about 8 or 10% of households. I think there's a fair case to argue that it's a racist policy, that given the pre-existing policies, that it's a racist policy. The GI Bill, again, had all these education benefits. That's the policy 1. But the pre-existing policy, the exclusionary policies, stopped a lot of Black veterans from getting those benefits. So the implementation was racist, even though on paper it may not have been racist. I picked these two examples very carefully because the GI Bill and the mortgage interest deduction are, thought of as not quite sacred cows, but at least the GI Bill, this is something the government did right. But there's clearly this issue in implementation. And I've thought through a lot of other examples. I have not found a situation where there is not a relevant pre-existing condition or policy that doesn't affect the implementation of a current policy. I encourage you to think of examples, but so far, everything from library cards to the GI Bill count as falling into this category. So let's move to the next slide, please. So everything I've said is not new. Critical race theory has been around for a long time. It's come up through the legal literature, to some extent sociological literature. It's virtually invisible in economics, although some of the thoughts are there. But the idea that past behavior and policy serve to build a racial hierarchy, to reinforce a racial hierarchy, cementing that past via new race-neutral policies is not a good thing, and that we should not analyze policies in harsh historical vacuum. These are, I don't want to do the 120th summary of CRT, but these are all elements of CRT that are basically what I was saying in the earlier slides. So these issues are pervasive, and so it's not surprising that they come up in taxes, given how important tax policy is. So let's turn to the next slide. So just to summarize, there's no airtight definition of racism. There's a definite, you know it when you see it, feel, but in racism, even more than in other issues, different people can see the same situation and draw different conclusions. I do want to emphasize a couple of three things. One is racial animus is not necessary for a policy to be racist. Likewise, the absence of racial animus does not mean the policy is not racist. Second is this notion that pre-existing conditions matter. And third, I don't want the conclusion to be, well, we can't define it, let's ignore it. The lack of a comprehensive consensus definition should not stop people from working on racial issues. If you think about something like social welfare, where debates have gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, the lack of a consensus definition does not deter people from thinking about it. And likewise with racial issues. These issues are too important to hinge on a specific definition of what's racist. All right, so that's the end of the first part of the paper. That's the part I tried to avoid writing, but kept coming back to and eventually put it down on paper. So let's turn to the next, which is the key conceptual issues. As I mentioned before, as I was reading these papers on racism, it occurred to me that the same kind of issues come up in standard public finance. And I apologize for the narrow focus on public finance rather than all of economics, but originally this paper was a speech to the National Tax Association, so it made sense to focus on the tax policy issues. So the first question, which the next slide covers, is which policies to examine. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of papers in the field look at a particular income tax expenditure. Like, is the mortgage interest deduction racist? Is the child credit racist? Is the EITC racist? And you'll get one answer. You'll get an answer if you look at a particular income tax expenditure. But you also want to remember that the income tax expenditure is embedded in the overall income tax, which is embedded in the whole federal tax system, which is embedded in this larger system of federal, state, and local taxes and spending. And ultimately, you want to look at regulations, laws, and institutions as well. So there's no right level. There's no single right level of analysis to look at in tax policy or in racism. But which answers people look at, which levels people look at, makes a huge difference. So let's advance one, and then let's advance on another. The second area is key conceptual issues. The best question in all of economics is compared to what? And people forget to ask that a lot. But getting the baseline right or the counterfactual right is literally half of the problem. And so this has a policy context and a historical context. It sort of overlaps with the first point. In the policy context, if we have a progressive income tax as the baseline and a progressive spending set of spending initiatives as a baseline, then it somehow, to me, it doesn't beg the question, but it's an incomplete answer to look at one feature within that system without looking at the other features. And then from a historical perspective, where do you start? Do you start with blacks not coming over to the country not being forced to come over to the country in the first place? Do they come over, but they're not enslaved? Are they enslaved, but there's no Jim Crow laws after that? Specifying that baseline is really, conceptually, it's easy. You just pick one of those. Empirically, it's quite hard to know how to do that. And for example, in the reparations literature, it's very important which one you choose. And it seems like the obvious one would be to start with slavery. But Boris Bitker in a NTJ article in the 1970s argued you should start with emancipation, not with the enslaved period. And I won't go into why, but obviously his is a voice that's worth listening to. But I think he's wrong on this, but it's worth reading his stuff. So let's go to the next slide, which is what criteria to use to judge the optimality of a policy change. And this is where the standard public finance and studies of racism and racial inequity really diverge. And the example to give is some policy gives everybody $1 and gives Elon Musk $100. Is that a good policy or a bad policy? Well, from a Pareto perspective, it's a good policy. From aiming to reduce racial inequity, it's a bad policy. And this conflict is going to pervade policy discussions. In fact, it already does. So let's go one more slide. The last issue is tax incidence, and incidence is really about tracing out the effects of a tax. And of course, you can do incidence in numerous ways. Suppliers, demanders, energy producers, energy consumers, rich people, poor people, workers, capital, blacks, whites, etc. You can divide up the economy however you want to and look at the incidence of tax issues. The point here is just depending on how you divide up the economy, several layers of incidence may be more or less relevant. For example, if you're looking at rich versus poor and you look at the state and local tax deduction, you would want some idea of not just who benefits from the deduction, but who benefits from the spending that the deduction encourages, right? And so if you start thinking about taxes in terms of Black people and white people, you kind of get different results. Like the 2017 Tax Act, for example, cut almost every tax that's borne disproportionately by white people. The corporate tax, the estate tax, the top tax rate, the 199A provision, and so on. So if you look at incidents through a racial lens, I'm just saying there's a natural tendency to want to emphasize different aspects of it, to take it to different layers, to trace out what we think are the full amount of relevant effects. All right, so that's the parallel and the conceptual issues. Let me turn now to the parallel in the topics. And again, I was really surprised when I saw this. If I told you I was giving the talk about institutional discrimination, systemic discrimination, anti-racism, and stratification economics, you would fix some ideas in your head. Then if we go to the next slide, if I told you I was giving the talk about unintended effects, general equilibrium effects, second best policy, and the relative income hypothesis, you would also fix a set of ideas in your head, but they'd be totally different from the topics in racism. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to argue that there's a lot of parallelism in these topics. Institutional discrimination is sometimes an example of unintended effects. Systemic discrimination is just general equilibrium modeling. Anti-racism is just second best policy. And stratification economics is just a relative income hypothesis applied to groups of people rather than individuals. So let's just go through that quickly. Go to the next slide, please. Donna Ginther at the University of Kansas has this great quote in The Economist that says, economics has a bias against bias. And that is, nobody in economics takes discrimination seriously unless someone can actually show that someone is choosing to discriminate. So Gary Becker had taste-based discrimination, Arrow and Phelps had statistical discrimination, Bertrand and Melanchthon had implicit bias, and Basu has a coordination theory, which is basically you discriminate because you think everyone else discriminates. So next slide. But discrimination can occur even if no individual is discriminating. This is a mind-bending point for economists, but I think it's like common sense to everyone else. There's an article by Small and Pager in the JEP in 2020 that goes through this, and they talk about examples like if your firm is hiring people, and the way it gets job applicants is it tells the current employees to go out and spread the word to their friends about job openings. Well, guess what? You're going to get a racial composition of applicants that look like the current racial composition of the employees at the company. Even if no one's discriminating, that's just what's going to happen. Layoffs based on seniority are a similar thing. And so these are classic examples of presumably unintended effects. They might be intended, but my point is that even if they are unintended, even if no one is actively discriminating, discrimination can occur. And that opens the possibility for a lot of corrective tax policy issues. And I just want to emphasize that I'm not claiming that all or even most institutional racism is unintended. In fact, it's probably the opposite. But there are forms of institutional racism that correspond to unintended effects. And that's the link I'm trying to draw in this example. So let's turn to the next slide. Excuse me. Systemic discrimination is one of those ideas that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And there's, I describe this as like looking at an Escher drawing. Like you look at it at first and you say, I don't get it. And then you get it. And then you can't not see it after that. So there's a wonderful quote from Michelle Alexander in her recent book that talks about racism being shaped not by, Klan marches or Nazi demonstrations, but by the way in which it functions naturally, almost invisibly, and sometimes with generally benign intent when it is embedded in the structure of a social system. And let's go to the next slide. David Foster Wallace had a more colloquial way of making this a similar point, not about racism, but it applies here. These two fish are swimming along. A third fish comes along and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" Let's go to the next slide. The other fish says, "What the hell is water?" And let's go to the next slide. And the idea is because when it's all around you, when something's all around you, sometimes it's harder to see than if it occurs in particular exceptional cases. And so this example is based loosely on a Thomas Schelling tipping point argument from 50 years ago. But suppose you start with a racially integrated neighborhood, white residents move out, property values fall. That means property tax revenues fall. That means the amount of resources linked to education falls. That means kids get lower education. That means they either earn less or they turn to criminal activities because crime is more attractive relative to work, and so on. You can see how this cycle repeats itself. The important point is, first, that the status quo systematically disadvantages the Black households that remain in the community at every stage of the process, whether it's housing or education or wages or the criminal justice system. And it happens because of disadvantages of discrimination at other stages. So let's keep going. Thank you. Economists tend to look for discrimination in particular areas, the labor market, the housing market, policing actions. But the point of the example before is that discrimination in one market spills over into other markets. All right, this is like the basic point of general equilibrium modeling in economics, or even macro mod. No, let's go back, please. This is like the point of general equilibrium or macro, that like if there's a disruption in the labor sector, that affects consumption. In the general equilibrium, if there's a disruption in one market, that affects other markets. So this notion of systemic discrimination or systems of discrimination should fit very well into general equilibrium modeling, and I've been trying to get people to do this. I'm not the one to do this general equilibrium model, but it just falls naturally into the kind of a multi-market perspective, if you will, that economists are used to thinking about. And from a policy perspective, it has this interesting implication that it suggests we focus interventions with these dynamic general equilibrium effects in mind. And that's another whole discussion, but let me just mention that. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, anti-racism is interesting because in the popular discussion, it's the most controversial topic. And I'm going to argue that it's equivalent to second best policy, which is the most boring technical topic in economics. So the motivating example is simple. Lyndon Johnson gave it when he talked about affirmative action in the 1960s. You have two runners who start out at the same time. One is ball and chain, the other does not. They run for a while. Obviously, the one without the ball and chain is way ahead. Someone comes along and then takes off the ball and chain of the second runner. The point is, if that's all you do, then what you've done is cement past discrimination into effect. That is, you've accepted the legacy effects and just said, okay, from here on out, we're going forward. That is, you let people get away with the hundreds of years of discrimination that have occurred. Next slide, please. So using tax policy to correct imperfections is a familiar concept to tax economists and tax lawyers. Is second best taxation is what it's called, although sometimes, of course, it's third or 100th best taxation. But some of the most obvious theoretical aspects are taxing complements of leisure and taxing activities that generate externalities. But you can think of anti-racism as a way of addressing past inequities. You can't change the past, but you can introduce policy to offset the distortions that past policies have created. So that's the idea. So then the last slide, or the last topic, stratification economics, is a different way of thinking about discrimination. This due to Sandy Terity, who's now at Duke University. And the idea is simple. People see themselves as part of a group, and the different groups try to protect their relative status. So this explains why racism discrimination exists, and it interestingly explains them as a result of a sustainable optimizing behavior. Like if you think of Becker and taste-based discrimination, the kind of implication there is discrimination is going to go away because it's going to be run out by profit maximizing firms. If you look at statistical discrimination, the Arrow and Phelps, the idea is there, well, the reason people discriminate is because they don't have enough information about the individual. And this argument says, no, that's not right. The reason people discriminate, according to stratification economics, is that is a sustainable optimizing strategy, and that people would do more of if they knew more. So one implication is, as groups become more similar, discrimination by the upper group, the dominant group, rises in stratification economics as the upper group tries to protect its relative status. Whereas under Becker or Arrow Phelps, as the groups become more similar, discrimination falls. And I think if you look at recent political behavior, I think you can make a really good case that discrimination is on the rise as the status of minorities rises in the U.S. and as the U.S. heads toward becoming a majority minority country. So the point here is just, this is very similar to the Duesenberry 1949 relative income hypothesis, which just stipulates that people derive utility from their relative status, not just from their absolute status. Okay, so next slide. I just want to conclude, first of all, by thanking you again for having me talking today. Working on racism and tax policy is an enormous challenge, but it's also an enormous opportunity. As you know, we all look for issues that are both important to society and amenable to analysis. And this, to me, this issue just stands out in both regards. It will require new language, new perspectives, new approaches. But economics does this all the time. If you look at asymmetric information or behavioral economics or stuff like that, economics is very plastic in those ways. I believe the law is too, but I will leave that to you to make the judgment. The bottom line, though, that I want to emphasize is for economists, the analysis of racism can draw on concepts that are familiar to economists, and I would think are familiar to lawyers too. So let me stop there. Thank you, and if there are time for questions, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. That was just terrific. And I have to say, it's just so encouraging to see an economist, especially such a prominent tax economist, to embrace these issues. So really, really appreciate it. I had a bunch of questions that I'm not going to ask because we have a bunch of questions, or a number of questions from the audience. And I'm going to jump right into them. And try to do it quickly because we just have a few minutes left. The first one harkens back to your library example and asks about, notes that funding for public libraries is limited because public libraries have closed, particularly in already underserved areas like Black neighborhoods, and asks about the interaction between government spending and taxes, which was probably particularly relevant, I think, during the pandemic.
Well, this also relates to the incidence discussion that if you're thinking about the incidence of a tax, you want to look at not just who's paying the tax, but who's benefiting from the spending that the tax revenues generate. I love the library example because I think it's probably it sort of strikes home. You can imagine a world where libraries are built in predominantly white neighborhoods, or more likely built in predominantly white neighborhoods where these access issues are concerned. Again, it's these everyday kind of examples that are almost innocuous on the surface, appear to be innocuous on the surface, that are so important. It's not just racial strife and the stuff that makes the headlines. It's the stuff we've gotten used to as a matter of course that also needs reexamination.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question we have is talking about a bachelor's degree, which could be in anything, and they note the opaque admission standards, and wonder about whether it's appropriate to have a bachelor's degree as a prerequisite to required training for professional licenses and advocacy.
I think that's probably a good example of unintended racism, where nobody is particularly discriminating. They're just saying, yeah, the requirements of bachelor's degree, and then it turns out, that white kids are more likely to get degrees than Black kids, and then so you perpetuate the inequality in that case through without even thinking about it. Mm-hmm. I think there's a ton of examples in the education system and then in the workforce issues that follow from education. I just read an autobiography by Michael Tubbs, who is the former mayor of Stockton, who talks about how the main reason he got out was that somebody helped him with the college admissions process and sort of taught him the kind of the unwritten language of college admissions, including changing your email address to something that wasn't like I am a stud, at gmail.com. Whereas if you do that with your friends, fine. But if you're trying to convey seriousness to an admissions committee, then that's an issue. But somebody had to tell him to do that, and there's just so much that's kind of the unspoken culture that reinforces itself that I think is really important.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. We have more questions, but I'm actually going to cut off because I want to be mindful of your time and the audience's time, and get everybody out of here on time.
Can I just say, people, if you have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. People should just send me an email.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time and just such an insightful, fantastic presentation. Really, really, really appreciate it. And I want to thank Loretta for her remarks, which were very inspiring. And thanks to the audience. Really, again, appreciate your patience with our little microphone issues and everything else. And thanks to our loyal sponsors, and hope everybody has a fantastic meeting. And we're just very much hoping that we can see people in person at a hybrid meeting in May. Again, that's going to be at the Marriott, May 12th to 14th. So hope everybody has a fantastic meeting. Thank you so much.